G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle. Today I want to finally talk about the 8th edition game, the state of the game, and the 40k hobby as a whole, which right now I'm very, very unimpressed with. Now, I don't want to confuse anyone with my intent here, so let's just get this out of the way. I am not saying previous editions were better. They aren't. They are bad in their own unique ways. But I don't think I've ever seen an edition fall apart so fast and so completely as 8th edition. Now, if you dislike 8th edition, great, you're probably going to love this. But by the same token, if you love 8th edition, you may hate this. And that's totally fine. I'm not here to tell you what you can and can't like. But maybe you'll find that some of what I have to say is relevant, and you can even give me some of your own feedback as to why it works for you, which always fascinates me, and I love to hear from my viewers. So, to start with, 8th Ed isn't just for dummies or children. It also isn't simplified, and I need to expand on that later. The topic is vast, so I'm going to break it down to a couple of categories to try and make sense of it, so that you, the viewer, can more easily follow along. One last little point before I start. I don't want to go into the economic side of things. Don't defend the game system by saying, oh, they need to do this to make money. No, that's off the table here. We're examining the rules and the climate of the game, not Games Workshop's financial motivations. Anyway, sit back, put up your feet, grab a drink, maybe a beer or a good whiskey. Get used to the word fuck, because you're going to hear it a lot, and enjoy the show. First things first, the core mechanics, issues with immersion and game-breaking elements. There is a massive overcomplication of rules. For example, having variants of a single rule, such as Feel No Pain, which units often get against different things. It makes no sense, because you're making it harder for people to follow along. Oh, it's that variant of that rule. Oh, sorry, I thought it was this variant of that rule and acted accordingly. My mistake. No risk in deep striking or reserves has led to people using what in previous editions we would call dangerous strategies, as they're actually guaranteed to pay off in this edition. In previous editions, you had to factor in a chance of failure and plan accordingly, but not anymore. Comparative weapon skill and no initiative means that, again, it's all about effective numbers and how elite a unit is. This is also related to another massive problem, theme and background, which I'll mention later. Death Stars are more of a thing than ever now. The entire game seems to be designed around them. Much like how people complained of allies matrices and psychic powers buffing units in previous editions, in the current edition, proximity of your HQ and command points now perform this role, essentially creating the same disastrous conditions that were prevalent in the dying throes of 7th edition. What about cover? It simply may as well not exist. Oh, you have 99% of your tank behind a wall? Yeah, well, my precision shot to the antenna is going to somehow fuck it up anyway. The ability of small arms and infantry to affect any unit in the game, not only strong units, but any unit, means that instead of having to choose your weapons wisely, you can choose what you find will be most effective against everything. And whilst those once strong units are now able to be affected by those infantry and such, they themselves didn't see a proportional increase in their own power. What do I mean by this? Well, Vindicators, things like that, they're arguably weaker than previous editions, whilst units like Guardsmen, once the paper to the Vindicator scissors, are actually dangerous now, and not just up close in assault, but at a distance. This is of course immersion breaking, and I consistently see verbal gymnastics, the likes of which would win gold at any Olympic Games, performed as a defence of this. More on that later. The removal of fire arcs and ridiculous split fire means that the game can never be balanced by human designers. The fact that a universe of items already penned and are now capable of doing exponentially more damage than ever intended actually means that the game it needs some kind of deep wave to balance it. Fire arcs and blast markers defined wargaming for decades. Now that every unit is simply a spinning gunboat, there isn't any need to develop any skill here. Now, more than ever, the game is decided by what you put on the table. For some, removal of blasts makes it easier. For me, however, it means that clustering up units has no downside, even against well-placed flamers. You go to all the effort of creating a perfect pincer maneuver, for example. You deploy your flamer at a blob of infantry, and it now has no more effect than the same dude firing it into a spaced out unit. Correct placement by both parties no longer matters in this regard. Now for the biggest flaws. Firstly, mortal wounds. They've become the go-to for any kind of competitive play. Now, what do I mean by competitive play? Cock-swallowing, win-at-all-cost players who interpret every rule to their advantage, who've been pulled aside at events and actually told they're being dickheads and to pull themselves back in? No, not that kind of competitive. I mean an army that can actually compete with someone. As in, play a fun, fair, balanced game. The reason mortal wounds have become so prevalent is that it's an easy means to an end. You need to damage the other player. That's the objective of the game. And you need to do it in the most efficient way. So when the option given to you is to use a better ability, mortal wounds in this case, anyone with any sense will take it and maximise on it. Mortal wounds is an arms race, and if you don't participate, you're only handicapping yourself. You're not taking any moral high ground here. Mortal wounds are far too easy to generate. They should be the rarest of the rare, or not even in the game at all. Instead, they completely negate some armies' advantages. You see, where once a single force weapon was something in an army, it was something that was limited to select few viable targets that you had to cast. You had to, great depth was involved in getting it to work for you, and many games it would not even pay off. Mortal wounds don't share those limitations. The greatest flaw in this edition, of course, is the bloat, which has reached a level I think is just completely unsustainable. You see, whilst it's fine to grow ranges and expand, and you need to as a company, there's a limit to what the consumer can take in mentally. Once, I could tell you every unit and weapon stat line from every codex, and I know many of us older players often owned a copy of every codex released in an edition. Now, don't make me laugh. You may need a rulebook, a codex, an index, an FAQ, a campaign book, upcoming formation rules, just to play a single faction. And if you add in allies, well, potentially double that or worse. This is unsustainable, and quickly confusion has set in with people struggling to keep track of what's going on at any one time beyond the most hardcore of gamers. Stratagems are either too powerful or pointless, and this has led to predictability as whole armies are built around their stratagems now. Generally, if you ask what one army a person is playing is, and they tell you, I'm playing Space Marines, chances are you'll be able to guess what 80 to 90% of the list is going to be thanks to the stratagems. It has led to stagnation in the variety and variation in the hobby. Instead of the varied flavours and themes of the 20 very different factions of 40k and their numerous sub-factions, I seem to see more fucking variety at a Horus Heresy event, where every single army is different, despite people always shitting on Heresy players and calling it a dumb Marine-only game. Guess what? The Heresy players, they have a narrative, and they build the army they want to build, not what some bullshit meta dictates. Theme and background are the last thing to cover in this section, because they're fucking dead and buried. I watched a competitive 40k event about a month back. I counted a minimum of 3 Lords of War per table. I also counted an average of 2 infantry units per table. That means there were more Baneblades, Knights, Demon Primarchs, even Titans than whatever actual infantry was in play. There's a game for that, guys. It's called Titanicus. But in all seriousness, it's an expensive hobby. So, like Mortal Wounds, people prioritise buying the kits which are viable and competitive when they build an army. This isn't to say that all people do this, because I know many people already assume the worst way to interpret my words. But it's definitely noticeable. Sure, people are out there at home building vast armies of all-foot marines. I'm sure of that. These people exist, but it's not what I'm seeing out in the wild at the moment. Armies on Parade, for example, was all about monsters and vehicles, especially knights this year. The infantry, the core of every previous edition, has just been pushed aside, and this notion that 8th edition supports a narrative is a blatant lie, as effectiveness on the tabletop has taken the place of modelling, and modelling what you love, whether that's for economical or for strategic reasons. So, those are the big problems, and in this next section, I want to talk about some of the excuses and mental gymnastics used to justify or play down what these key problems are. This section is called Excuses for 8th edition. Here are a collection of quotes from people defending the state of the game, which has nothing to do with the core mechanics or issues. It's basically just bullshit excuses. And I want to share them as they're pretty common, they crop up a lot, and I can break them down a little. Firstly, nothing new, Games Workshop has always been bad at rules. My response to this is, because they've failed in the past, it doesn't excuse their actions now. You shouldn't be more lenient with them because they set the bar low. The idea of implementing new additions is to enhance and improve, not to fail in new and interesting ways. These days, people play Games Workshop games for two reasons. They love the aesthetic, and they don't care about anything else. Or, they can't bear to change games because of the crazy amounts of money spent in the hobby. This is true. I shall call this Hobby Stockholm Syndrome. I think we'll call it Nottingham Syndrome. I also have to note that there is a loyalty to Games Workshop, not dissimilar to how people seem to love sports teams or cars. The very thought of playing another team or playing another game, it's very foreign to many people. Just something I've noticed. Another commonly sprouted line. If you don't like 8th edition, don't play it. Stay with 7th or whichever previous editions you want. Like you said, it's your hobby and Games Workshop doesn't control you. I still play 3rd edition, so I can whip out the Witch Hunter Codex, 6th edition so I can field my Necron army with customizable cryptex, and 8th because Sisters of Battle are surprisingly strong for an index list. See, the dilemma with this quote is finding both like-minded people who want to play the games with you and finding the community/resources. Now, whilst I have a copy of 3rd edition's rulebook, and anyone could probably download it, the problem you face is that, well, there aren't 3rd edition tournaments anymore, so you're not going to scratch that itch. You're going to be playing against a restricted group of people. You're not going to get much variety in there, therefore your game's going to be a lot less interesting than if you were playing, say, 40k 7th edition, where, you might play Eldar, you might play Tau, you might play Space Marines all in the same day. Chances are, if you go back to 3rd edition right now, you're going to play one other friend who has a army that they'll play in 3rd edition, and it'll be Sisters versus Chaos 16 times straight, for example, which will get very old very fast. And also keep in mind, the armies back then had a lot less variety in the builds. Now, the problem with that is that, well, thanks to a lack of USRs and having only about a tenth of the units that we've got now, that's going to create problems. Because if you want to add in more units to add some variety or anything like that, yeah, you're going to have to make up the rules yourself. And because there weren't any, what do we call, universal special rules back in 3rd edition, they were a 4th edition invention, well, it's going to be very difficult to create a whole bunch of specialised units for the game out of new kits, because basically in 3rd edition the big determiner of a unit was their stat line. Because there wasn't Feel No Pain, there wasn't Furious Charge, there wasn't anything like that. In 3rd edition, it was mostly just down to your stat line. And there's only a limited number of combinations you can make of stat lines. Next quote. It's okay for infantry to damage tanks with small arms, or for vehicles to shoot a las cannon from their antenna. It's not trying to replicate real life, it is instead trying to show in shorthand what is happening. So, the whole point of each phase in Warhammer was to show the motions. In the movement phase, you move. In the shooting phase, you shoot from the point which you ended your move at. This is a step-by-step process and is largely the same as ever. Hit, wound, save, more or less. By suggesting that the vehicle has ducked out from cover, taken a shot, or that it fired on the move to a position at a target that it can no longer draw a true line of sight to, all these things overcomplicates and it ruins the immersion. It's left the game open to abusive mechanics, and the last thing any edition of Warhammer has ever needed is more loopholes and mechanics to abuse. Oh, this quote's one of my favourites, guys. It's so simplified compared to 7th. The old charts were too hard to follow. Is it? I feel a bit unsure as to how this fallacy is still kicking about. Shooting was once roll to hit, roll to wound, roll to save if you could. Cover all, armor save dictating. Simple enough, yes, charts were used. But I've had the chart memorized since I was 9 years old. I haven't ever had to sort of go back and check my ballistic skill and my strength. Because people who've been playing as long as me, we seem to generally know off the top of our head how the chart works. And I can't quite comprehend how people who have been playing as long as me don't know that. What was so hard? Weapon skill. If mine is better, I hit on 3s. If it's equal, 4s. If yours is double mine, +1, I hit you on 5s. Wounding. If my strength is 2 or more points higher than your toughness, I wound on 2s. If it's 1 point higher, I wound on 3s. If it's equal to your toughness, it's 4s. If it's 1 point worse, 5s. If it's 2 to 3 points lower than your toughness, it's 6s. And if it's 4 points lower, I cannot physically hurt you. That's it. I just explained the entire weapon skill and wound charts in 2 sentences. Were they really that complicated? For new people, perhaps. But I mean, I had this nailed by 9 years old, and I was no child prodigy. With that in mind, what is the shooting phase now? You're kind of told what you hit on, nominally, but then you've got the added step of modifiers now coming into play. So, oh great, there are more steps involved in shooting. Maybe you go through all the steps of, I've added my modifiers, now I've hit my target, now I've wounded. Oh, well, now you see I do multiple wounds to you instead. So now I've got to calculate the multiple wounds per wound taken. There are more steps involved in shooting. If you have to take more consideration into account in order to perform a task, you haven't simplified it. You've managed to do the opposite. This logic applies to the Force Org chart. Once it was 2 troops and a HQ minimum for an army. Bam, easy. Now, there are dozens of combinations of what constitutes a basic army. Instead of everyone stepping off from the same starting position, the possible variations and the balance problems inherent in that just got amplified exponentially. What do I mean by this? It means that by giving you every option, they made it more complex and so more unbalanced, while still convincing people that it's still somehow simplified. What do I mean when I try and explain this? Well, you can charge a certain amount of points for an elite unit in a certain slot in the old Force Org chart. Because you know that, hey, if someone gets this unit, they've had to spend a lot of points to get to this point, therefore it can be a bit cheaper. But if you give them, like in 8th edition, the option of taking that really strong unit straight out the gate, well, it needs to cost more points. Because there's no, like, troops tax or anything like that that involves them getting to it. They've just got it now. You see the problem here? Another good quote. I struggled with 7th edition and I just couldn't keep track. 8th edition is so much better. So, much like the last quote, it wasn't that hard to keep track of the core game mechanics. The problem was list bloat, because the further you deviate from the Force Org chart, the worse the game got, and not having the list compiled into one sourcebook was a massive issue, as people often encountered formations and detachments which they didn't understand. I hate to break it to you, but that same problem is back with a vengeance in 8th edition. Now, for those who say the only things they play are basic units, or they only use one source book or one index, I only have this to say to you. You've moved the goalposts. You aren't playing the game at its full potential, and you are artificially handicapping the system due to recognizing the limitations. Okay? Now, this is totally fine. It's something I actually approve of. If it makes the game more enjoyable, go for it. But do realize, this is not the system working as intended. This is your own handiwork at play because you've changed the rules, you've limited things, you've balanced it in your own way. This is not GW doing the right thing, this is you fixing their mistake. So, this last section, I want to talk about the future of Warhammer 40,000. What do I see over the horizon? With the system that is as flawed as 8th edition, I can see a few potential outcomes, and I'll give those predictions now. Firstly, the cracks are only just starting to show. As the things I predicted a year ago have come to pass, bloat being key among these. If you go back and listen to the old episodes, I think basically Games Workshop will play it one way. They will do what they do every time they've lit a fucking edition on fire through greed or ineptitude. They will relaunch, and in this case, I think slightly rebrand it. Now, I don't think they'll launch it as 9th edition 40k. I imagine simply a title like Warhammer 40,000. The emphasis on the simplicity once again. Maybe even bringing back the old tagline of "in the grim darkness of the far future" and making that front and centre. They're trying to take on board the lessons of 8th edition. That's the sort of thing they'll say. You know, the basic PR jargon. They'll try and sell 8th edition as a learning experience and that the new edition will fix all your problems, like some 19th century love tonic. I don't think this is a wild or far-fetched prediction either. I have, how many versions of Warhammer to use as historical evidence that they've done just this? You see, the rebranding, it won't be as excessive as something like Age of Sigmar, which completely upturned the reality of the game. They learned that they burnt too many bridges with that move. It would be too on the nose to name it something like Age of Guilliman or some similar tripe. So, like Hollywood reboots, I think they'll just try and pass them off as fan service. Games Workshop would likely take their approach. In the end, nothing will really change. There will be no exodus of players, no great GW crash, simply another edition will fizzle out, and a new one will launch. It'll sell a ton of starter sets, it'll net all the people working up top at Games Workshop a nice profit, and then the cancerous monetization, which has plagued every single edition since 5th edition, will set in again with vigour, until it gets so bad they have to relaunch it. I can't overstate this enough. I make this prediction because I've seen this very same company in the hands of the exact same people do this a dozen times already. I'd love to be proven wrong, to be encouraged to pick up the game proper again, but I just don't see it happening. I've been burned too many times. Anyway, Make with the Outer Circle, please, thoughts and feedback in the comments below, as always. Love to see what you come up with, guys. See you all next time.